Hey everybody, this is Enrico E. Manalo here, Chief of Learner Success for All Aces Inc., joined today by Enin Rudel, PsyD. Dr. Rudel's most recent publication, Emotional Intelligence, Organizational Social Architecture, and Blackmail Leadership, appeared in Advances in Developing Human Resources, Volume 23, Issue 4, published in August of 2021, which also won the Issue of the Year award. Dr. Rudel is also founder of EI Consulting, a consultancy centered around emotional intelligence. You can reach out to Dr. Rudel via LinkedIn. Welcome, Dr. Rudel. How are you? And what exactly is organizational social architecture?
Well, first of all, Enrico, thank you so much for having me here today. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to come on your platform and talk about my research. So, in defining organizational social architecture, I want to begin by pointing out that it's really fusing two terms that existed previously, right? In social architecture and organizational architecture. So, conceptually, now putting those two together, organizational social architecture, this is sort of the working definition that I chose to run with for my research, is the study of the development of organizational culture at both the organizational wide and individual levels. It's designed to highlight the role of the leader, who in this context is serving as the social architect, and whose role it is to shift and influence the values and behaviors of organizational wide culture.
Wow, thank you so much for that clarification. And so, not only did that issue win Issue of the Year, but you actually coined that term. Is that correct?
I did, yeah. And actually, I didn't realize this when I was going through the process. I found this out much later.
Oh, okay. So,
Mhm.
if anybody out there is watching comes into contact with this term, well, you know who to credit with its creation. Something that we've noticed about organizations is that many opportunities to violate dignity often creep in unintentionally. So, it seems that what you're getting at is that by involving more types of people in decision-making processes, perhaps there may be more opportunities for people's dignity not to be violated. But before we move on, I want to pose a question to our audience. So, audience, what I'd like to ask you is what workplace challenges have you heard or seen blackmail leaders face? And if you're interested in better understanding how dignity factors in the organizational experience of BIPOC, then check back with us for our experiential learning workshop, the Dignity Activity, which we'll be offering throughout the year. All right, so to pivot back to our questions, and how do you kind of talk about yourself? Is that as a consultant? Is it as primarily a researcher, as a organizational psychologist?
So I think it depends on the context. It depends on the capacity in which I'm serving. But by and large, I'd say organizational psychologist is sort of the catch-all.
Okay, and so you've told me a little bit about your background, but how did you kind of fall in love with organizational psychology? You know, not everybody is aware that organizational psychologists exist. It's something that I have toyed around with someday becoming. I'm not sure if I have it in me to do a PhD at this point, but you know, it's out there and it's hugely important to the work of consulting for sure, but definitely DEI consulting.
Definitely, definitely. So a little bit about my trajectory. So by trade, I'm a licensed psychotherapist and spent a number of years working in that capacity. And it was actually during my time working in a large hospital setting that I began to understand how the systems that we're a part of affect us in a number of different ways. And that actually served as the inspiration for me to return back to school to pursue this doctorate in organizational psychology. I think I viewed it as a platform to, not just consider and explore the human condition, but to really consider systems as
Mhm.
well.
You know, what I love about your story is we talk a lot about work-life balance, but it's rare in my experience that people actually directly connect work to our health, right? Yes, we talk about mental well-being and things like that, but there's still kind of that separation. It's mental health. It's not my actual health, right? It's kind of the same thing that people do, like, oh, that's my work self. This is not my actual self. But the secret is that there is no separation, right? That's the same mind, that's the same health, and you're the same person at work that you are at home. You might be engaged in different activities and displaying different parts, but you are the same person.
Absolutely. And I would say that the last 2 years and everything that we've been going through on a societal level has helped to really underscore the idea that there really is no separation, right? Gone are the days where we could be viewed as just an employee. It's
Right.
imperative that organizations begin to understand that we bring our full self into every environment that we're in. And there should really be some understanding around what that looks like um, with respect to social identity.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it also kind of strikes me that if we are not showing up with our full selves, then this provides opportunities for organizations to overlook or sometimes forget our humanity. And that's something that we're seeing has had broad effects on our society and largely negative, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The absence of that understanding can be debilitating in terms of one's ability to fulfill the scope and range of their role, whatever role that might be. So, having that understanding from the organizational perspective is really the ideal way to set an employee up for success.
Right. And, something that I found through my research is that it's so hugely cost inefficient not to attend to the humanity of employees, right? We get like an insane amount of turnover. And I don't think that people understand how expensive that is. Like, I've seen figures that say 30 times the annual salary of a single employee simply for searching for a replacement and retraining. Like, if we're in an economy that prizes efficiency over everything, then why do we have these huge inefficiencies, these glaring inefficiencies that people kind of take as normal? And maybe that's not something we can answer in this session, but you know, a- anyway, I guess one of the things that I'm really curious about is what is it about the intersection of black male leadership, emotional intelligence, and organizations that kind of motivated you to research it?
So I'll begin with stating that my research is very much rooted in my story, my narrative, my narrative and trajectories, both personal and professional. So for me, it was an opportunity to really speak on where I've been and the experiences that I've endured along the way, and how these constructs sort of come together is this idea that emotional intelligence, in this context, in relation to this research, can be used as a coping strategy for being able to bring your full self into your role and to best understand not just what's going on for you, but what's going on around you. So we have emotional intelligence as the construct, and then of course the organizational social architecture as sort of the overarching theme. But the convergence of all three of those, I think once I realized that you really can't separate black male leadership from emotional intelligence, it seemed like a natural fit.
And I was fascinated in reading your work because I'd never seen somebody frame emotional intelligence as a coping strategy, and so I'm just kind of curious, how did you arrive at that realization?
Mhm. So, I started out testing it as a theory, and as I moved forward, so let me back up for a minute. So, I interviewed 12 Black male executive leaders for this study, right? And emotional intelligence surfaced across the board. So, I,
Mm,
I I began from a place of wanting to test it out, and as the research progressed, it began to surface organically as something that these guys were saying that they all use to get through their day to day.
And just a note on that. So you mentioned that your study had a pool of 12 participants.
Mhm.
That might not sound like a lot to people who are more used to qualitative research, but as a qualitative researcher myself, I can assure you that when you tap into something that is understudied and you identify a great population to ask those questions, the volume of data that they will provide with you is unreal. Like,
Absolutely.
I don't know what your coding was like, but I imagine that it was dense.
Absolutely. And thank you for highlighting that. I can share with you, it took me 6 weeks to
Oh,
code this data. I ended up with, I think it was 410 pieces of data that needed to be analyzed and sort of coded. So I mean, there was a lot there. I'm glad I stopped at 12. I'm glad I didn't hit saturation. I think 12 was enough. Absolutely.
I mean, I'm
Absolutely.
having flashbacks of transcribing notes right now, and
Yeah.
that's a lot.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure.
So, just following up on that earlier question, how do your findings help to challenge the broader social narratives around blackmails and blackmail leaders in particular?
So I think in challenging this narrative that Black male leaders are often aggressive, and then taking this step further, recognizing that sometimes folks struggle to interact with us, and sometimes even will go to great lengths to avoid interacting with us. Everything from making eye contact or avoiding conversations altogether. I think one of the things that this research exposed was underneath all that, these men were vulnerable and their vulnerabilities surfaced, and they all spoke about it in a very real way. Themes like double consciousness,
Yeah.
themes like two-ness, right? So just to give some context for two-ness, it's I am whatever role I'm in, but I'm performing that role as a Black male. So there's a layer of complexity there that often doesn't get talked about, and leads to a lot of these men feeling there's a lack, an absence of psychological safety.
Right, because it's like at any time, their performance, so to speak, could be exposed. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that really kind of puts black male leaders in a very fragile or perhaps tenuous kind of position, right? Like you're trying to satisfy these competing needs that are probably not only confusing to other people, but perhaps confusing to the person who is experiencing it too, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I would add that across the board, these men spoke about this being the primary reason why they've left roles in the past.
That's terrible.
Yeah, yeah, and again, the absence of psychological safety, oftentimes creating these spaces where they just don't feel valued or supported or understood.
Right. And I've seen people minimize when people kind of express those kinds of feelings. So,
Mhm.
for the audience's sake, I just kind of like to relate this back to childhood experiences. I think we've all kind of, if we attended public school, for example, I think we've all kind of been in a situation with other children where one child, for one reason or another, was shunned, perhaps for that afternoon, perhaps longer term. But when people are hesitant to interact or are not willing to do that, even if they don't say anything, that's something that humans pick on very quickly. And so if you're in this environment where you know that you are perhaps not welcome, at the very least, or not wanted, that has a real effect on your ability to connect with other people and again to feel safe. I know that sometimes when we talk about childhood challenges, we expect kids to, quote, just get over it. But there's a lot more research coming out now that adverse childhood experiences have much longer term effects on people. I guess I'd like to pivot to the audience once again to ask, in your workplaces, how might more organizational support for Black male leaders impact your work? And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about emotional intelligence and how that can advance racial equity, we've got a link that my colleague Miles is going to be dropping into the comments. So, Dr. Dell, what can organizations do to elevate, celebrate, and retain Black male leadership?
Okay, so there's a lot there, and I think we're going to unpack each of those buckets, specifically starting with elevate, right?
Yeah.
How you talk about high potential Black male leaders when in rooms with their peers, managers, and senior leaders matters. The perception that's created around that individual matters. Second, I would encourage organizations to provide adequate support and advocacy within the context of that individual's assigned role. Third, foster alignment between identified personal strengths and business objectives. When that doesn't happen too many times, again, that employee is not set up for success and can ultimately flame out of that role. Now, moving on to celebrating, as in what can we do to celebrate Black male leaders, make a concerted effort to better understand and recognize our strengths, name and validate our perspectives, ideas, and contributions, recognize the value of our unique perspective, and lastly, demonstrate an understanding of our insecurities. Show me that you understand what it's like to be me in that environment. Now, granted, I understand that, I get that that's obviously not easy to do if you don't identify the way that I do, but there is something to be said for at least making the effort to create spaces for dialogue around social identity and how it shows up for me. Lastly, in considering retention, again, reflecting on my own trajectory, I can share instances where when these conditions were present, I have felt encouraged, I have felt valued, I have remained in that role for a longer period of time. So going back to a point, Enrico, that you made earlier around job retention, but also the cost of onboarding, for those that don't understand the importance of DE&I, and for those that may require a business case to be made for why this matters, the cost of losing an employee and having to onboard another, helps underscore the importance of this issue, as if we even need to go there. But I understand for some we do.
Yeah, and I feel like it's so easy to forget, but a lot of business success is reliant on relationships, right? And if you are not doing things to elevate, celebrate, and retain, well, those are missed opportunities for developing relationships that could be very fruitful in the future. We have a comment coming in here from a LinkedIn user, an anonymous one, and it says, as a Black male senior leader, at times it, quote, feels like your expertise is questioned no matter how correct or educated you are. Part of my own research is around organizational silence. And from my findings, when people are not listened to, there's only so many times that people are ignored, glossed over, or not listened to before they start feeling like, you know what am I even doing here? Why should I even bother sharing my ideas? And of course, in an organization, this could have literally destructive side effects, right? Organizations are all about sharing ideas. So anything that gets in the way of that kind of gets in the way of doing the best work that we can. Um, so if we're kind of using this particular Black male senior leader as kind of a jumping off point, are there kind of, I know that there aren't a lot of specifics here, but just kind of connecting back to those definitions that you laid out for us, what might you say to this person, or more specifically to their organization?
So, in speaking to the individual who posed this question, this as a shared experience has come up multiple times in my initial research and in the research that I've done since then. I can certainly attest to workplace conditions where I have felt all but silenced. So I mean, I think that this is a very real issue. And to organizations, again, it goes back to really putting pressure on organizations to begin creating spaces where we can hold dialogue to move past this, right? And start viewing um, uh, uh, diversity as a strength, right? When we start thinking about diversity of thought, diversity of experiences, instead of viewing it through, some of the narratives that you and I have been speaking about.
So when we're talking about creating spaces, right? I know that there's been more interest recently in creating ERGs, employee resource groups,
Yeah.
affinity groups, but there are a lot of questions that come along with how to run those things, right? People are always after best practices, or maybe they've had kind of negative experiences. So I'm kind of curious, like, if there are people kind of watching this and wondering, like, okay, I'm running an ERG. I love to be able to do what Dr. Rudel is talking about, but like, how do I do that? Do you have some kind of, I don't know, some ideas on what's worked for you or what you've seen be particularly effective?
So I recently conducted an organizational assessment, and part of that was to sit with this organization's ERGs. And across the board, one of the themes that came up, folks feeling like they're not being heard,
Mhm.
feeling like the ERG was created so the organization could check a box. I'm saying that this is a unique opportunity to really be able to open pathways for real dialogue and conversation. So beyond meeting as a group, what I would say is, for executive leadership to really take an active interest in what these ERGs are experiencing. What are they saying? What's the nature of the conversation? Our leaders carving out time to even attend one of these meetings to hear from people directly, or are these conversations just sort of happening over there somewhere, right? And allowing the organization to check a box and say, "Oh, look what we're doing." Right?
Yeah.
We're supporting these groups. I think there's so much more that can be done.
Yeah, and in talking about kind of leadership attending, I know that something that's come up for in my line of work is that sometimes I've run into people who run ERGs that say, like, well, I'm glad that we got some buy-in from leadership, but frankly, having the leader be in the session all the time is kind of stifling conversation. So how do people kind of strike a balance there?
Well, I think so. That's the key word: striking a balance. I wouldn't ever suggest a leader make themselves a part of that group and a consistent attendee for those meetings, but certainly, having showing interest, even if it's once a quarter, once a month, whatever it is, carving out time to either attend the group or to maybe meet with the leader of that ERG,
Yeah.
right? And just to gather themes of uh, what's the nature of the conversation that's surfacing in that group meeting.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely sounds pretty consistent with what I've found. I think it's one thing to be a part of the group, as you say. It's another thing to be an honored and welcome guest, right? But if it's for these certain employees, giving them that little bit of power to say who is and who is not in the meeting, that can
Mhm.
go a long way towards psychological safety for sure.
Absolutely.
And so you've brought up dialogue a couple of times. I know that dialogue is something that you engage in. It's something that I'm trained in and have done a lot of work in, especially with an organization called Solia. And it's one of the tools that we often make use of in conflict resolution, which is my background. So in engaging in that work, something that I learned very early on, which kind of surprised me, but I guess once you dive into the social sciences, you run into terms like this a lot. And what I'm getting at here is social science kind of suffers from this thing where we'll use terms that are the same as terms that people would use in regular kind of speech, but they have a very different meaning, right? So on the news, we might see people saying, oh, yeah, we need greater dialogue to address whatever issue, right? But for someone like myself who is trained in dialogue, I know that we are not talking about the same things at all. And so I'm wondering for our audience if you could just kind of be a little bit more specific about what it is that you mean when you say dialogue.
So dialogue, through my lens, exists on a spectrum, right? There's a fundamental difference. I think what you're talking about is conversation. There's a
Yes.
difference between conversation and dialogue, right? Dialogue, again, through my lens, is more of it's a two-way street, right? So I am actively listening. I am utilizing reflective listening, right? I am taking time to make sure that I understand what you're saying and that you know that I understand what you're saying. We're having conversation now around intervention strategies. So we're not just sitting and talking, we're having a conversation with a very clear objective in mind.
Yeah. And there's usually a structure and a process there, as well as agreements on what's going to happen before, during, and after, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's really important because in conflict resolution, dialogue is not considered to be action, right? So people talk about taking action. Really, this is the thing that we do to set ourselves up for intentional action. And I think that's a really important distinction, right? Because sometimes people they want to have a dialogue, but they don't go through any kind of preparation or any planning for what comes next. And then they end up being surprised that even though it was a great conversation, perhaps, not too much changed.
Mhm.
And I think that can be demoralizing, right? So you're putting in all this effort, you're really trying, but then the outcome is not very much. So I don't know if you've got kind of some ideas for people on how they could actually drill down and have real dialogues that can set themselves up for success.
Well, I think having there be a greater alignment between the conversation that took place and the actions that follow. So I shared with you that I'm coming off of an organizational assessment where I met with that organization's ERGs. One of the common themes that surfaced throughout all those conversations is this idea that folks feel like there's just sort of speaking in this silo and nothing is coming from it,
Hmm.
right? And so I think, to go back on a word, I love your use of the word intention. There has to be an intentionality behind, why we're having these conversations. Are we just talking, or are we, making a conscious, concerted effort to see how we can, set intervention strategies in place?
Yeah, thank you for that. So something else that I'm kind of wondering about is if you've got any ideas on concrete steps, and our audience and clients, of course, are always after concrete steps. But what are some concrete steps that people can take even if they aren't in leadership positions to support black male leadership, right? So sometimes we get this idea in organizations like, well, I'm just kind of a worker bee. And when somebody says jump, then I jump. And, if I didn't jump high enough, then maybe my pay gets docked. But there are lots of things that we can be doing in non-leadership positions to support one another. And so are there things that people can be doing to support black male leaders specifically?
At a fundamental level,
Hmm.
give credit where it's due, right?
So what
Um,
does that look like though?
Well, so I'll give you an example. This happened to me recently. So last month, I'm in a staff meeting, and again, I am the only Black male on staff at this firm. And I had finished sharing an idea, and one of my colleagues jumps in front of the entire group to not only support the idea, but to take some time to share why that thought was important and why it mattered, right? So, I mean, it ended up being, for me, it felt like a very powerful demonstration of support at a key moment. I
Mhm.
would add providing genuine validation and support just generally speaking, recognize that for us, us being Black men in positions of leadership, understand that we often don't experience psych safety. There's more times than not that's absent. So I think understanding that and doing what you can do in the context of your role to help create that safe container. And lastly, recognize the various ways in which you can support in a timely manner. And I think that speaks to the example that I just gave, where here I am in a team meeting, and one of my colleagues makes a point of coming off mute to highlight why my idea was effective.
And thank you and that was a little thing that you just did there, but like when mentioning coming off mute, a lot of us are working remotely these days. Some of us are going back to the office. But it's really easy in a Zoom setting to be perhaps more passive than we might be in person.
Yeah.
And so even that little bit of effort, it can make a difference. And so if we're going back to this example that somebody was kind enough to write into us about, right? Um, I think in your example, it kind of addressed this directly, right? So somebody acknowledged your expertise, and in doing so, also perhaps non-directly or indirectly, rather, acknowledged how educated you were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm. So, question to the audience. In the context of your role in organization, what could you be doing to support Black male leaders? And yes, we've also got another link that can go along with that as well. Um, so, we were talking about dialogue a little bit earlier. But in your view, what is the role of dialogue in preparing for organizational change, especially in the context of supporting Black male leadership? Like, how could people put this into action?
So again, being intentional, right? And first of all, viewing dialogue as a tool, viewing it as a vehicle to gain insight into alternative perspectives, particularly among underrepresented employees in the organization, right? Making that conscious, concerted, intentional effort to hold the dialogue, the kind of dialogue that is going to lead to a shared sense of understanding.
hmm And so, for people who have not had the opportunity to participate in a dialogue, um, I'm kind of curious because I've done this quite a lot myself, and sometimes what I've noticed is that people get nervous, right? It's something that maybe they've never done before, and they're like, "Oh, I'm not gonna know what to say." So, how do you kind of like help get people over the hump?
I would say name it. Name what you're experiencing. There's nothing wrong with prefacing your effort with, I don't know how to say this, or I don't know how to even enter into this conversation, but you know, whatever it is. But I mean, there's nothing wrong with sort of naming it, owning it. And I tend to respect people who approach me and are open and honest with, hey, I may not say the right thing here, uh, but I'd like to have a conversation, with you. I think there are ways where you can enter into those conversations and sort of make this informal contract around, okay, I may not get the wording quote unquote right here, right? But I want you to know that I have the best of intention, right? And just sort of beginning from that place and then moving on from there.
So I don't know if you've also experienced this, but there have been times where I've been conducting dialogues or preparing for them and trying to get people to participate. And on broaching the topic, I kind of got the sense that the person I was talking to was reacting as if I had said, "We need to talk." And it's like, yeah, we need to talk, like, that literally, that's what we have to do, but this is not like, "We need to talk and you're in trouble," you know?
Again, I mean, I think contracting for that conversation. And what that looks like for me is setting some parameters around your intention. You know, what is your stated intention? What is the outcome that you hope for? Right. And I think putting that out there and using that as a jump off point so that there's a shared understanding of why we're even entering into the conversation. I found that that can lead to folks lowering defense mechanisms and being a little more open to engage.
Mhm. Yeah, and I can't think of many tools in my toolbox that help people to really get at the personal stories quite so incisively or perhaps so directly,
Mhm.
right? Um, and so I'm kind of curious. Have you? I know that you interviewed a bunch of male leaders, but have you been able to conduct dialogues among Black male leaders?
I have, unfortunately, I'd say that it's been few and far between. But in my experience, this is, I can name it. I mean, I've been in environments where it's been like crickets. Nobody wants to talk, right? And so it's having to break through that layer. And I'll give you an example. The scenario that I'm referencing, the first 15 minutes felt like it was just kind of me having a conversation with myself before people began to feel psychologically safe enough to enter into the conversation. And so I think that there are some things that can be done early on for that conversation. I set the framework. I made the intentions clear. I let folks know what I was going to be doing with the data. And I think if you can strike that balance, because you don't want it to be too structured, right? But if you can strike that balance, you can set yourself up to hold a meaningful and productive dialogue.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I just dialogue is a theme that we keep coming back to, and uh, as my work progresses in the realm of diversity, equity, inclusion, I'm kind of surprised that it's not a tool that's used more broadly. Um, I don't know if this has been your experience, but sometimes we get clients, they say that they want workshops, and then it turns out what they actually want is a dialogue, but they didn't know how to ask for that.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So most recently, I worked with an organization that was looking for some DEI related workshops. And we actually ended up pausing the workshops when they recognized that they could benefit from some focus groups. They could benefit from some qual interviews, right? And so we went back, we recontracted and re-entered with some of these modalities in place because they recognized what was happening at the workshops. Again, when there were these pauses where they were hoping to engage people in conversation, nobody spoke.
Mm,
Nobody spoke, and so someone somewhere in the leadership team used that, or better yet, um, seemed to recognize that folks weren't talking, and there was likely a reason for that. And it's likely that they would capture more narratives if they developed focus groups and
mhm.
had these interviews. So I think again, being intentional with the intervention, and I guess knowing what's needed,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, and I think that understanding can be a hard one sometimes, right? So something that I learned as a mediator is that when people keep bringing up the same thing over and over again, even though maybe been talking about it for like 2 hours, whatever, often there's an element of stuckness there, right? So we're talking about the importance of acknowledgement, but once you kind of acknowledge the thing that they're trying to get at in a way that resonates with them, that usually like kind of unplugs everything and it starts to flow a lot better.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so I think it's you know, again, going back to the importance of dialogue, but also kind of understanding what it takes to get that dialogue to flow is deeply important. So I don't recommend that people undertake a dialogue unless they've got a good facilitator.
Quality facilitation is critical to this process. because oftentimes, it's finding a facilitator that's dynamic, finding a facilitator that can really that can read the room and understand sort of what's needed and meet the group where they're at. Facilitation is a skill like anything else. And I mean, I would caution, to your point, which I think is a great one, I would caution any organization from entering into these spaces without giving it the process its due diligence.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, I think that kind of the theme that we're circling around here a little bit is sometimes we need people to help to guide us, right?
Yeah,
And I know that for me, as a Filipino man, originally from New England, it hasn't been easy to find people that share the same kinds of identities to help guide me. So it's kind of been very piecemeal. And I imagine that for Black male leaders, mentorship is also probably kind of a challenge. I don't know what you may have found in your research.
absolutely. That theme came up 100% of the time.
100% of the time.
100% of the time, these gentlemen all essentially were saying different variations of the same thing, right? Lack of mentorship, and how the presence of mentorship at critical points along their trajectory could have made a difference.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
That just hearing that, I mean, that must be a hard realization to grapple with internally, you know? So I don't know if in hearing that you've got some kind of recommendations. I know that there are many organizations that would love to be able to provide greater mentorship, but maybe they've had some challenges or some barriers to actually implementing those kinds of things. And so I'm curious, are there things that you're seeing that people can do to create greater mentorship opportunities for people in general, but Black male leaders specifically?
I would say starting like it feels like a good starting point for me would be to acknowledge the absence of mentorship to that individual and to work with them around identifying appropriate resources, right? And making sure that the organization is supporting that individual in his pursuit of identifying an appropriate resource. And what that looks like for me is actually, carving out time to time in and effort and energy to helping connect that individual to resources.
Yeah, so people often, or more and more, I'm seeing, we've got the acronym DEI. Sometimes people say EDI,
Yeah.
but increasingly, I'm seeing people attach access to that.
Yeah.
And I think it was implicit in what you were saying, but perhaps if an organization does not have people who could serve as mentors to Black leaders or people of other affinity groups within their organization, then perhaps they are best served by looking externally. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I actually touch on that in my dissertation. So I'll use myself as an example. Multiple times I've been the only Black male either in the organization or in the department, and oftentimes I've known of, let's say, I've had a counterpart at another organization across town, right? Even making an effort to provide a space for the two of us to sort of connect in a meaningful way would have been really helpful, you know. And I think that's what we're talking about. So like, I'm not sure that access can any longer be an excuse.
Mm. Say more about that.
Well, I mean, I think I get that organizations oftentimes say, well, they struggle to find employees of color, particularly Black men. Um, I think I get it, but then my question is, or actually, no, I don't get it. My question is, yeah, no,
I
I don't,
love it. Yes.
I don't
I don't get it either.
yeah, no. And my question is, and then what efforts are you making externally? because in the example that I gave you, I knew of at least 3 or 4 Black men in this city who I had to meet by accident, right?
Mhm.
Like in just various ways, right? Like I met a few on LinkedIn or just through various outlets. But I mean, it would have been nice to have the organization say, okay, how can we support you in creating a network?
Yeah,
How can we help you make time in your day where you can have this once a month or whatever frequency it is, kind of space where you can connect. Instead, more times than not, I've had to, and a whole lot of us have had to kind of do it on our own.
right. When really, you're kind of doing it so that you could be successful in that position that you're being paid for, right?
Exactly, exactly.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that if organizations really want to step it up in terms of mentorship, they can be not only acknowledging the fact that perhaps they don't have internal mentors, but creating space for people to seek them out. That still seems like the onus is on the individual person. So I'm kind of curious if you got thoughts on, concrete steps that organizations could do to better position people to receive the mentorship that they critically need.
Again, I think it's partnership, it's collaboration, it's providing support, it's making sure that your employee doesn't feel like they're in a silo or sitting on an island. I mean, I mentioned that there's a few I've had instances where I've been the only Black male in that department,
Yeah.
right? It just doesn't feel good. So I mean, I think what surfaces for me is the power of collaboration. I've never had. Um, an organization support my efforts to foster a network of professional support.
Yeah.
And I think that probably would have made a difference, particularly when I go back to the beginning of my career, where I really struggled. And I want to go back on something that you said
Yeah.
earlier. You made a comment earlier about how we're all products, something to the effect of like, we're all products of our psychosocial history, right? We're all products of our past.
Mhm.
So, my experiences, let's say, I was the only Black male in my middle school. In my high school, I think we had about 600 students. I was one of, I think, 8. So by the time I entered the workforce, I had been conditioned to understand that I might be the only one in the room, and that's got to stop.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah,
okay.
I didn't realize that we had so many parallel experiences, but I've often reflected with my team and with friends, like, you know what? I actually don't know how to be a Filipino man. I didn't really grow up with any except for my father, and I felt a little bit lost at times, and that's been kind of hard for people to connect with. Like there are many messages in society telling people who they should be, who they should aspire to be, and in some sense, I've felt outside of that, or it's like, well, that message is not for me. It's close, but it's not for me specifically.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I've had to code switch so often that it's sad when something like that becomes almost like second nature,
Yeah,
right? Because I'm just not. I don't have the luxury of being in diverse enough environments, and I mean it is a sad reality, and I think that's again what encouraged me to tell my story.
yeah. Well, I'm glad that you did because you've, got wonderful research out of it. And I know that you've got a couple projects developing, right? You've got your EI consulting and perhaps a couple other things. But, as we're kind of drawing to the end of our conversation, I'm kind of feeling like uh, perhaps what we could recommend to organizations that are watching is you might and this might be good fodder for a dialogue actually, is what would it look like to have a dialogue with your staff of color, with your staff who belong to various identity groups that are perhaps not advantaged, and to hold a dialogue around what it is that they need to be successful, because we don't always know. There are a lot of assumptions there. but people are coming from all different places, and of course, their needs will develop independently. So, I don't know
Yeah.
what you think about that.
Yeah. Well, I think at its core, I think that that's a beautiful sentiment. What I would add to that uh, is that if that conversation is going to take place, there needs to be something done around the fear of retribution.
Oh my God, yeah.
I'm not going to talk.
Yeah.
I don't care who approaches me. I'm going to smile and nod, even though inside, yeah, I might want these things, but above it all, I want to pay my bills. I want
Yeah,
I
yeah.
want to keep my job, right? And so, I mean, I think if it can be done in a real way, and in a way that names that fear, uh,
Mm.
and so, I'll give you an example. I was sitting with one of these ERGs, and this was probably about 2 months ago. There's an ERG for Black employees, where we had a very real dialogue around the fear of retribution. You know,
And in my own background of conflict resolution, and my focus was organizational conflict. One
Mm,
of the greatest dynamics that silences people and stops them from sharing really perhaps risky or innovative ideas is very much that fear of retribution. And
yeah,
we've been talking about psychological safety.
yeah,
Nobody wants to feel like they're under the gun or that they got a sword hanging over their head. Like, you are not going to do your best work under those conditions, period. You're just not.
no, you're not. You're not. And there's reasons why I show up in spaces the way that I do, dressed a certain way. Being mindful of how I'm expressing myself, because I'm acutely aware. I am a bald 6'1" Black male. I'm acutely aware of if I get frustrated versus if my, let's say, white male counterpart gets frustrated. I'm acutely aware of the perception around what that looks like. So more times than not, it's having to filter, filter my thinking, and then that's where that whole organizational silence then comes into play, where eventually I shut down and I don't share.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, the goal is maybe not to have people share all the time,
Right.
but to be comfortable enough to really contribute in the ways that they really want to, in the organizations that they've been invited to join in the first place.
Exactly.
Like, I feel like work is this weird push-pull where it's like, we know that people want to work, they want to be useful, they want to do something meaningful with their lives, and then we have to jump through all of these hoops to get there. And then
Mhm.
once we get there, we're dehumanized
Yeah.
at multiple levels
Yeah.
over many years, and we're just expected to be okay. That doesn't make any sense to me.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. And I would add, in the case of these men that I had the privilege of interviewing, in the case of my own trajectory, and many others, the thought that surfaced for me throughout the journey, throughout this particular research journey, was how much more effective could I be, or how much more effective could any of these men be if they didn't have that fear of retribution, if they felt psychologically safe, right? Because what I fear has happened is, in any given moment, for me, I'll use myself as an example. I am acutely aware of how I'm being perceived. Am I dressed appropriately? Am I viewed as intelligent enough? All of these things, you only have 100% to deal with. If I'm
Right.
using 60% before I even get to the role, what's left for me
Yeah.
to actually use in that role? And that has to stop. And that's what this is all about.
Right. Also, and not to take away from what you said at all, but when an employer asks you for 110%, that
Mm,
is worker exploitation, and you don't have to take that.
love it.
I think the last question that I want to ask the audience is, we've been talking about dialogue, psychological safety, a lot of these different kind of interrelated issues. And so when organizations call for greater dialogue, especially around issues relating to BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color. How effective have those quote dialogues been in your experience? I want to know because I think that there's a lot of not great dialogue happening out there. And I think that by acknowledging it, maybe we can help to bring about some actual good quality dialogue. So please do let us know in the comments. And in our last few minutes here, Dr. Rudel, what would you love to see come out of your work? And I know we've talked a lot about the different work that you do. So that could be your publication, that could be the work that you're involved in with IBIS or William James College, any of that.
I'm going to boil it down to 2 words: increased awareness. That's it. I recognize my privilege and I've been blessed with this platform and I want to do something with it. I didn't ask, to necessarily be in this position. A whole lot of us didn't ask, but I'm here, and so for me, it's making sure, for those young Black men who are coming up right now, that, my hope is that they enter into a workplace culture that accepts them, that supports them, that values them, and that they won't have to go through some of the stuff that I had to go through or my father had to go through. So, this really is about awareness. And, I think, I am so proud of where this research has went. And I can say to you now, there's a whole lot more coming.
I'm really glad to hear that. And, I would love to see more Black men becoming organizational psychologists. I know that there is not a lot of literature on Black male leadership. So I just want to thank you for undertaking that research. I know it was really deeply personal to you. But yeah, honestly, in my own research, I was able to find almost nothing specifically about Black male people in the workplace, which is kind of crazy.
It is.
All right. Well, once again, Dr. Enin Rudel, please do connect with him on LinkedIn if you are interested in learning more about what you can be doing to support Black male leadership in organizations and beyond. And once again, if you got any comments, questions, or thoughts for us, please do drop them in our comments. We'll be sure to respond. Intentionally Act Live is actually going to be back in 2 weeks. We are now on a bi-weekly schedule. So that means on March 25th. Once again, my name is Enrico E. Manalo here for Intentionally Act Live. See you next time.